Welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Today we're going to listen to a recent interview with biblical scholar Dr. Michael S. Heiser, another one of Art Bell's previous guests. We discuss the origins of the Bible and examine some of the criticisms or accusations some people have of the text and see if there's any misconceptions. First, let's see what Seth thinks about some of the issues covered. Hi, Seth. How's things?
Hey, Scott. Pretty all right here. It's been raining nonstop here, but of course that's good old-fashioned Washington spring. So, just more of the same.
Yeah, fair enough. It's been quite hot here as usual in Thailand, but don't want to make too many people jealous. So I believe you had a chance to listen to the interview with Dr. Michael Heiser. Was there anything that caught your interest?
Quite a bit. By the way, great job with that interview. Just what I'd listened to so far. I thought you did a wonderful job of steering the conversation in a lot of different directions to get the most out of it in as little time as humanly possible without necessarily pushing it too far, too fast, or something like that. And it gave him a chance to expound upon quite a few different ideas that people have been questioning for quite a while. Also, what really stood out to me more than anything was the difference of opinion between him and even many other people that you'd had of Christian scholars or Christian theologians there that you've had on the show about a number of different topics within the Bible, between literalism and metaphors within the Bible there, which I thought was a very, very, very interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean there was an awful lot to talk about. That's why I split it into two basically, and you listened to part one. And what other things sort of captured your interest?
Well, the fact that he's actually a doctor in this, I mean, he's stated it took him about 15 years to get his doctorate in this, but at the same time, he actually spent a large portion of his life on this and isn't just some passing sort of fan of many of these different ideas, many of these different texts, because he's not just reading the Bible, though the Bible is his main source of much of his information. He does read many other different dialects, which is very, very important for somebody studying ancient cultures.
Yeah, indeed, and yeah, it's good to speak to someone who's studied something like this in depth because there's a lot of people who have beliefs about the Bible text, sort of Christians and non-Christians, and it's all passed through word of mouth. But it's good to talk to someone who really knows what they're talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, just the differences of him learning all this different stuff and actually reading and being accepting of different ancient cultures for what they are there, as opposed to trying to fit it into a biblical paradigm of actually showing that there are many things that are anti-biblical or unbiblical, rather, that are amalgamated into modern day Christian thought. But in reality, it has nothing to do with the Bible.
Yeah, so hopefully we can discuss some of these issues in another show amongst ourselves. But sadly, we don't have too much time to chat about it at the moment. We might as well go straight to the interview, and we'll talk about it in a future episode.
Oh, well, thank you, Scott, and I look forward to it.
Me too. Thanks, Seth. Dr. Michael S. Heiser is a biblical scholar from the US. Mike earned an MA and PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and ancient Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mike also has an MA in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania and can translate ancient languages such as Biblical Hebrew, Biblical Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Phoenician, Moabite, and Ugaritic cuneiform. As far as I know, he's still currently the academic editor at Logos Bible Software. People may have come across Mike if you're interested in ancient astronauts topics and through appearances on Coast to Coast and with Art Bell. He's also on other podcasts, and we're lucky enough to be joining that list of other podcasts. Mike, welcome to Truth Sentinel.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's not often that most people get to talk to a biblical scholar, and that includes Christians. I thought I would take this opportunity to clear up some misconceptions that people may have about the Bible, as well as talking about some of the topics I've heard Michael talk about in the past. I know that some of my questions might relate to Michael's research, but also some might be perhaps more about his personal opinions. First of all, Michael, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background and interest in biblical studies.
Yeah, I didn't have any sort of religious upbringing when I was younger. I became interested in Christianity when I was a teenager and decided, I wanted to become a Christian. And, really from that point on, I really had a deep interest in the Bible, but before that, I mean, I had a deep interest in anything old and weird. So, the Bible's just sort of fit in that drawer. But it became, really something that drew me in. It was fascinating. I didn't lose my interest in other ancient things, but this sort of became a focus. And eventually, I figured out that, boy, I'd really like to do something related to antiquity and specifically the Bible, for a living, if that was possible. But I was really, really kind of ignorant. I remember when I was in high school, that was the first time I found out that people actually paid ministers, paid pastors to do what they did. That would probably shock people to know that how could you not know that? Well, I didn't. And so when I discovered that, it's like, well, boy, I'd like to be able to support myself, do this for a job. And so I decided I need to go to college. I need to, eventually go on for a doctorate. And, it wasn't a neat process by any means. It was actually kind of flying by the seat of my pants most of the time because I didn't have any money. So I'd go to school, sit out a year, go to school, sit out a year. But it took me 15 years to get through graduate school. Usually it takes people about half that time. But I eventually made it through, and I decided to go into Old Testament because I liked languages. They were fun. I had a good aptitude for that. And I also thought that was where the strangest stuff was and the most problems, at least as far as what people were sort of taught about the Bible and about the ancient world. So, Old Testament, ancient Near East became my focus, and I've certainly enjoyed it and haven't regretted that.
Yeah, and that would be probably a good place to start with the Old Testament and actually the beginning, Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And most people know the first few words of the Bible, in the beginning.
And even those aren't clear.
And it says in the beginning was the Word. And I know you've spoken about this before, but I've always found that sort of strange. Like, what does that mean? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's actually John chapter 1, but it's an echo of certain things in the Old Testament. I mean, in my book, The Unseen Realm, which just came out last September, which in and of itself is a story, the product of about 15 years of, the nice word is research, the negative word would be psychosis on my part. This thing that drove my life for about 15 years. But in that book, I talk about this concept. Genesis 1:1 is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, he creates with the spoken word. As you keep reading, and get to verse 3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. But when you go to the New Testament with John, as you quoted, you get this passage about in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And, scholars, some scholars anyway, will say, well, obviously John here was borrowing from, Gnostic writer X or, Neoplatonic or Platonic this and that. It's none of that. It comes right out of the Old Testament. There are passages in the Old Testament where God appears visibly in human form and is referred to as the Word of God. In other words, this, God appears as a human being, and that's the way we have a conversation with humans, because humans can parse that experience. And it's also in biblical theology done to protect humans from the sort of the unveiled glory presence of God. But it's an expression that refers to a manifestation of deity, a manifestation of God. And of course, later on in John, in verse 14 of the same chapter, we read, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then it goes into the gospel, the story of Jesus. So Jesus is not only the embodied Word, not only the embodied God, and you get that in the Old Testament, God as man in the Old Testament. But the story of Jesus, the story of the Gospels, is that God became incarnate, which is even sort of upping the ante when it comes to, a self-revelation to humans. So the concept is really about an appearance of God in human form, but the language sounds kind of strange to us, but it comes right out of the Old Testament.
And no one's really ever described God, but presumably, according to Genesis, he looks exactly like us. Then, if we were created in his image.
Yeah, I mean, in the Old Testament, and it's mostly the Old Testament because this is where the New Testament draws its ideas and in many cases its language from. God, fundamentally God has a problem. Actually, has two problems. One is I am so other that if I came to human beings, and I love human beings, I want to have a relationship with them. That's the whole logic of creating humanity back in the garden story. But if I do that, they'll not be able to understand what they're even experiencing, and they'll die. So I've got two problems here to solve. And so that's why God consistently in the Old Testament is sort of mediated. He picks a form that humans can parse with their five senses, either a voice or something visible. And most of the time when it's visible, not all the time, but sometimes it's fire or something like that. But most of the time, overwhelmingly most of the time, it is as a human being, because again, that's what makes humans comfortable. That's what they can process. They understand that experience. And so that's the mediating form. And you go all the way back to Genesis 18 is the most obvious example where God and two angels come and they have a conversation and a meal with Abraham. And we find out their identities as we read Genesis 18 and 19. But God is there as a man. It doesn't look any different. Of course, some things happen that make it evident that there's something else going on here. But that's sort of the the mediated form of choice, and you can actually find that in the Garden of Eden story, where Adam hears God walking, in the cool of the day. It's anthropomorphic language, and they have a conversation there, but it's actually sprinkled throughout the Old Testament. It's nothing original to the Gospels.
And talking of the Garden of Eden, how much of Genesis would you say is literal? Was there a literal Garden of Eden? I remember listening to another podcast. I think it might have been Hagman and Hagman with Stan Deo, and he was talking about where he believed the Garden of Eden was. Do you believe there was a literal Garden of Eden? And if so, wasn't it supposed to be guarded by a flaming sword?
Yeah, it's actually not an easy question, because it goes beyond a yes and a no. So, was there an Eden? Was there a place known as Eden? Well, I do think that we're given specific geography to it. It was actually sort of a region, and then in that region, Genesis 2 says God planted a garden in the east of Eden. So Eden is actually a region. It's not just this little plot of garden land or something like that. But even if you say yes, well then, okay, how do we, what is it about this place that we are supposed to process and understand and embrace, as far as the literalism of it or not? So even if you land on yes, this was a place, then there are other questions to answer. I think Eden as a place, what we're really being asked to affirm in the Genesis story is that God comes to earth. Eden is sacred space. Eden is a place where heaven intersects with earth, where the supernatural intersects with the natural, if you want to use those terms. And it shows us that God wants to dwell among his creatures, the things that he has made, and the intelligent individuals he's made. And again, it becomes holy ground. It becomes sacred space. And the notion of God doing that with humanity, and of course we have either a literal or a paradigmatic, and the answer, maybe yes or both. Adam and Eve, a first couple, if we want to say it that way. And again, I don't think that's contrary to evolution, even though many Christians would. But God, has this human pair, we'll say, and wants to start a relationship with them. And so, that his commission to them is, I want you to, make every place in the earth, on the world, like this place, spread Eden. And that becomes what's known in theology as the dominion mandate. The cultural mandate is another term you'll hear. And it's based upon, be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. They're also commanded to steward the earth, to take care of it. But then spread, Eden throughout the whole earth. And then, of course, things get messed up. So there are bigger truths than, can I plot Eden with latitude and longitude? There are bigger ideas going on here that transcend mere literalism in the Genesis story. But a lot of Bible readers sort of get fixated on the literalism question, and this isn't by any means the only passage. They tend to read it, in my judgment. If you're fixed on wooden literalism, you sort of tend to read the content artificially, and you miss what the writer actually wanted you to catch, the bigger ideas that he wanted to convey through the process of how he's telling the story, so that you don't have to deny one or the other, but to get stuck on one or the other and limit your vision to either literalism or total anti-literalism or mythology, sort of really misses the point. There's a lot here that transcends either landing place.
Do we know who wrote Genesis? And was the story dictated by God to the author of Genesis?
No, I think dictation, and pure dictation view of inspiration, how we get the Bible, is really rare nowadays. It's nonsense, but I think even lesser versions of it, people try to come up with what I refer to as an X-Files view of inspiration, or a paranormal view of inspiration, where the writers, are sort of petrified or paralyzed. Their minds go blank. Their arms and fingers start waving and moving, and poof, they pop out of the trance and they look down at the table and think, wow, that's kind of neat. Boy, did I write that? I can't wait to read it. These are phony. They're artificial views of what's going on. I mean, any biblical book, and I'll come back to your question about Genesis in a moment, but any biblical book, guess what? The biblical teaching about how these sacred books originated is that God used people. Like, wow, isn't that profound? Well, on one level, it's not. On another level, it is, because what inspiration really says, what it's really describing is God's providential role in the lives of people who are prepared, again, through a whole range of experiences, that God is the unseen hand behind those experiences, preparing them through training, through tragedy, through success, through all sorts of things for this moment that he would prompt them to write something down for posterity. It's a very normal human process, except that, again, in biblical theology, God is behind these events to put that writer in the right time and place and occasion. So, humanly speaking, Genesis is attributed to Moses. I don't think that Moses wrote, Genesis 1 to 11, for example. I don't think that comes from the hand of Moses. I'm not what's called in biblical scholarship that the standard view is a documentarian, JEDP theory, that the Torah is the result of a bunch of, a patchwork quilt weaving of, 4, 5, 6 different sources. I don't believe that, because the reasoning behind it is often circular. I'm what used to be called, I guess, in the 19th century, a supplementarian, and that is, I don't see there's any reason why Moses couldn't be a real person and could not have written down a lot of what we have in Torah as told to him by his own ancestors, and he writes it down. He codifies the stories that were passed on through oral tradition, and composes things himself. But there are things that are quite evident in Genesis that he didn't write. But I'm not bothered by that. People take the law of Moses phrase, Torah Moshe, and they say, well, you have to believe that Moses wrote every word, or else this is a horrible heresy. Well, that's absurd, because it's in Hebrew, it's just a construct phrase. It just means, it could mean many things. It could mean the law produced by Moses. It could mean the law about Moses. It could be the law associated with Moses. In Hebrew grammar, these kinds of phrases have a wide semantic range. But people don't really stop to think about it, because they're usually reacting to something. And, higher criticism has taken the idea of any Mosaic authorship, even the existence of Moses, and just poo-pooed it. And so you have people who have a high view of the Bible and they want to react against it, and they go 180 degrees when they really don't have to. So, yeah, I mean, sure, he could have written part of Moses or part of Genesis. Maybe he didn't write any of it. I think he did. But on one level, I don't really care. Most of the authors of the biblical books, for instance, are not even named, so they're anonymous. I'd say easily half of the books of the Bible are anonymous. The writers don't give us their names.
And I know you've looked into the grammar of the Bible. Well, looked into is probably not the word. You're very knowledgeable about the grammar. And
had it beaten into my head more.
I wondered if you could explain a little bit about the us that are mentioned in Genesis. Let us create them in our image. And I had a look on your site, and I think I might be right in saying that you wouldn't describe angels as being that they could be described as aliens. But I just wondered why, if you could go into who the us are and why they couldn't be described as aliens.
Yeah, the plurality in Genesis 1:26, let us create humankind in our image. And then in verse 27, it switches back to singular. So God created humankind in his image. Okay. And I talk about this in my book, The Unseen Realm, about why there's plurality and why there's a switch to singular, why there's this interplay. There's plurality there because initially God is speaking to his an audience. He's speaking to a group. And you say, well, who's the group? A lot of Christians would say that's the Trinity. Again, I don't believe that at all. I mean, I am a Trinitarian theologically, but the Trinity is not in Genesis 1:26. Who's there is the members of the heavenly host, again, what scholars call the divine council, which is a term taken from Psalm 82, verse 1. God is speaking to the sons of God who are there, according to Job 38, verse 7, who were there before the foundation of the world, before humanity is created. And God is announcing something. Hey, let's do this. And it's not the Trinity because standard Trinitarianism would have the other members of the Trinity co-eternal with God. So why would God need to make an announcement of something they should already know? Doesn't make any sense. So that's not what's going on here. But God says, look, let's do this. And that the plurality links God, them, his audience, and humanity in some way. Because they're all connected by the language. But when the creation actually happens, there's only singular. The grammar is always and only singular. God is the lone creator, and humans are actually created to be his imagers. Well, then why the plurality? It's because the idea of imaging, which is kind of a long one, we'll skip for this point, unless you want to go into it a bit later, or people can read the book for that matter. But the idea of imaging is representation. So humanity, by definition, is the image of God. We are God's representations and his representatives, his agents, as it were, on earth in this terrestrial plane. And the plurality shows us that the same idea is true of non-human entities, the divine sons of God, the heavenly entourage. If you want to call them angels, fine, even though that's technically imprecise. But they also image God. They also represent God in the spiritual world. And they are like us in this relationship. And so that's why we have plurality. But when it comes down to creative power and creative authority, then the grammar is always singular. And to the alien, question, if when people ask that, one of the first things I want to know is, well, how are you defining an alien? And typically it's the extraterrestrial, it's the space alien. Okay, well, space aliens, again, if they're the product of evolution, if they're out there, I mean, I'm not offended if there are aliens. I think it'd be kind of cool personally, but I don't find it a theologically offensive idea. But if they're out there, they're bound by the laws of physics. They have to, have some form of nutrition, probably hydration. If they're carbon-based life forms anyway, they have to reproduce their species to live. They need craft to fly around or whatever. This is not the way you see angels described, not only in the Bible, but other texts as well. One of the curious omissions in ancient astronaut theory that nobody likes to talk about, if at least if they buy that idea, is that there are no texts in any ancient culture that have the gods coming from one planet to this one. There are scenes of the gods flying around, and so that's extrapolated into spaceships and whatnot. The best example you get are the Vimanas, which are like flying houses, but they're not aerodynamic or anything like that. That's the best you get. But even they are not interplanetary. And that's a huge omission for ancient alien theory. And again, it's illustrative of this disconnect between how angels, spiritual beings, are presented as opposed to the idea of an alien, which would not be a spiritual being. It would be a very physical being by nature that needs to do all these other things like reproduce and eat and drink and all that stuff.
Couldn't they?
So
couldn't they?
they're
Because you mentioned the angel that had a meal earlier. So in that
form,
yeah.
you could argue that maybe we have an interdimensional being. Okay, this is where the next thing goes. Again, there's two facets to that. Okay, does the interdimensional being, is it a spiritual being or is it a physical being from a different dimension? I mean, if we traveled from one dimension to another, we wouldn't, we'd still be physical beings by nature. Well, if it's a physical being, then that's a disconnect, with the angelic idea. If it's a spirit being that then takes form or appears, visually as embodied, well, then you have a connection with the angel idea, at least the way the angels are presented in the Bible and other ancient texts. So it's actually not a simple question. People tend to assume that there's this simple equation, those silly Bible readers, they don't realize what they're dealing with aliens here. Well, silly ancient astronaut theorist, you haven't asked about 4 or 5 questions that need to be asked and answered. And the problem on that end, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to snipe here, it's just a real problem, is that we're not given the answers to a lot of these questions. But if you're going to strike the equation, you kind of need these questions to be asked and answered to talk coherently about what it is you are embracing, what the idea is you're embracing. So I see a lot of disconnects, again, but depending on how the question is framed, at some point you can start talking about possible overlaps. But they're all speculations. My major objection to ancient astronaut theory is people that use ancient texts and they import these ideas into the text when the texts don't actually say them. That's cheating at best. At worst, it's manipulative. It's not telling people really the truth about what they're reading and the limitations of what they're reading. So that's kind of my big gripe with the whole thing. There's ancient alien theory has everywhere, and all of its proponents have a disturbing propensity to fabricate information and fill in gaps, and then not tell people that's what they're doing.
Whilst we're sticking with Genesis and the origins of mankind, Adam and Eve. One of my friends always asks me, wouldn't the offspring of Adam and Eve have had to commit incest? And so that was just one of the questions I wanted to clear up. Would you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you believe in monogenism, which is a 19th century, well, actually even earlier term, one original pair, then yeah, you have to have interbreeding on that level. Scientifically, people can legitimately talk about, well, the reason it's a problem now is because we've had so many environmental effects, and we've had so many opportunities for genetic mutation. And if you get a mutation and you have interbreeding, then the mutation is perpetuated or made worse or something like that, again, in layman's terms. And all of that's true. If we're taking the story at face value, back in Edenic days, that wouldn't have been true. So it's not a problem. There is no moral law, against it, in the biblical story originally. Later on in history, there is, and there are different reasons for that. The laws in Leviticus, for example, they're not doing genetics, they're not doing science, even though they could figure that out. But the laws about incest are at least defining the inner family as opposed to the extended family, and drawing sexual lines between the two. They're really different reasons for that. But we don't have any of that going, in the initial human story. And so, the people biblical writers and whatnot would have framed it that way. This is, again, the origin of the population. We don't have this other baggage, either in terms of a natural result or some of these other reasons to observe these boundaries. We don't have these problems here, so who cares? Now, if you believe in, and there are plenty of people who did and who still do, believe that there are cryptic references possibly, and that's an important word because by definition a cryptic reference isn't a clear one. There could be indications of co-Adamism. In other words, you don't have a single origin point, single couple for humanity. You have more than one couple. For instance, where did Cain get his wife? And I think even the better example is when Cain is expelled from his, by his parents. He goes off and gets married, but he builds a city. Okay, well, he didn't do that by himself. It reads like there are other population groups. So if you're a monogenist, you say things like, and this is true, we're not given a chronology in Genesis. We don't know how many years, we don't know how old, Cain was. We don't know how many years it was between this and that. And you could have lots of other kids multiplying. It could be centuries. And so that would make sense in a monogenistic framework. But the other side would say, well, you obviously have humanity started in different places, and that's who Cain's marrying and working with. God just happened to select this one couple to focus on. And it's also true that Adam and Eve are paradigmatic, especially Adam, to Israel. In other words, a lot of things that are said about Adam and that happened to Adam mirror things in the history of Israel. And so people would say, well, that's deliberate. That's how we need to look at Adam. Adam is selected from other humans, just as Israel was selected from other nations, and their stories parallel each other. Both of those things are you can defend from the text, and again, but by nature, a cryptic reference, isn't clear. But you have people on both sides of that issue.
Yeah, I can see that. Like other couples might not have been mentioned. Another thing that many non-believers would say about the Bible, talking about things that aren't mentioned, would be things like dinosaurs. Do you think dinosaurs are mentioned in any way at all in the Bible?
I don't. I think references to Leviathan and Behemoth in Hebrew, are not giving us descriptions, eyewitness testimony to literal dinosaurs and, ichthyosaurs or something, sea serpents or sea monsters. And the reason is because these things pop up, especially Leviathan, explicitly in Canaanite texts, outside the Bible, where they are very clearly mythological, or mythopoetic is the academic term. And that is Leviathan, also in Canaanite it's Leviathan or Lotan, is a well-known, fairly ubiquitous symbol of chaos. In other words, the forces of chaos and disorder that God, or in the case of Canaanite religion, the gods, have to subdue and tame for humans to be able to function. And so these things are often brought into the Bible. Psalm 74 is a good example where, God, the creation language, the language of Genesis 1 is used in Psalm 74, and then Leviathan is thrown into the mix, where God slays, Leviathan, he slays the sea beast, and then he brings about, either creation order. And it's also applied to the Exodus, that the sea becomes dry land and people pass through it. So the idea is that in the beginning, God made the earth habitable. He tamed the forces of chaos, and at the Exodus, he defeats the gods of Egypt. He tames the waters here of the Red Sea and saves his people. Again, there are ideas here that to the ancient, and this is the key thought, to the ancient person, not to the modern person who wants to cheat because of science, okay? To the ancient person, the meaning of these passages transcended literalism. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't see these terms and these motifs for what they were to the ancient mind, we're going to miss a lot of the things that the writer wanted to telegraph for us. Again, the bigger ideas of Scripture. But it's just unfortunate. We have a lot of people who love the Bible, have a high view of it, but they are so transfixed on this wooden literalistic approach that they actually miss a good deal of what's being taught in the text and what was intended to be taught by the writer.
Does that mean the parting of the Red Sea didn't happen, or when we don't know whether it happened?
Oh, I think parting of the Red Sea is a historical event. I don't think, I mean, we're so used to thinking of Charlton Heston when it comes to that, but I think actually later adaptations are better. There's the one with Ben Kingsley in it that I think is really the closest to the text that you get. I don't know if your listeners may have seen that. I don't know if it's shown in the UK or not, but Ben Kingsley is Moses in one of these, and it's very close to the text. God tells him to go out there, hold your staff over the water, and over the text actually says the wind blew all night, and the result was that the waters were parted, and it made a dry path for the people to cross. Again, it's still a miracle, and I'm not offended intellectually by miracles. God can intervene if we. A lot of these things just extend from the question of is there a God or not, which proposition makes more sense. And then if you land on the theistic side, then you have really simple questions. Well, can this God act? Can he speak? Can he do anything? That sort of thing. And so since I accept that, I don't have a problem with a miraculous event. But, does that mean that, it's sort of described or happened in the way that, Hollywood has given to us? Well, probably not. But I think you still have a divine intervention, to rescue the Israelites from Egypt. And that, you had to have a pretty astounding thing, miraculous thing happen for that to work. And I don't have any problem with that, but I tend not to Hollywoodize it in my head.
And moving on to another slightly different topic, the Tower of Babel. I know you're a linguist, so that's where all the languages were mixed up. And I wondered if you had come across any evidence that the Tower of Babel existed and that modern languages can be linked to one particular place.
Yeah, I think this is a good example where there's an overclaim by biblical interpreters based upon what the text says. The easy part of this is the tower itself. Yeah, archaeologists have found a ziggurat at Babel, and they typically attribute this particular structure to the story. And so that's kind of the easy part. But there's a lot about the story that people don't know, that they're not taught in church or they're not taught in Sunday school. And that is, we know this thing about the text actually says God confused the languages, and scattered the peoples. Again, that is transparent. That's what people tend to hear in church, and all that sort of thing. So, the people that were there, that were present at the time, they get their languages confused as part of this scattering. Okay, it never says, and it can't because of Genesis 10, that all the languages of all the peoples on earth that we know today are involved in this event. Because in Genesis 10, we get a listing of the nations that the biblical writers knew about. Okay, it doesn't include India and China, North America, South America, Central America, Australia. It doesn't include any of that. So people tend to sort of, again, overclaim things for what the text actually says because they don't observe the context. But anyway, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 is actually a key element to understanding what's going on at Babel. And this is the part that you never hear about in church, you never hear about in Sunday school. And frankly, it's because most pastors and ministers and whatnot don't even know that it's here. And that is, here the verses say this: when the Most High, again, it's not hard to figure out who that is. Okay, that's God. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, okay, there's reference back to the division of the nations at Babel. When he did all that, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, Yahweh's portion, is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Now, this passage, many of your listeners, if they pick up a Bible at this point and say, well, I never heard of that before, they might read in verse 8 a different phrase, that God fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And that is what most English translations say. It's not the correct reading. Sons of God is the correct reading. That is the reading that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But you don't even need textual criticism to figure this out. It wouldn't make any sense for God to scatter the nations at Babel, to divide them according to the number of the sons of Israel, for a very transparent reason. Israel didn't exist at the time. Israel is not listed in the table of nations in Genesis 10. It's only after Babel that God calls Abraham and begins the story of Israel. So you have a clear example here where someone, a scribe at some point, fiddled with the text, took out sons of God, also took out the reference to the gods in verse 43 of the same chapter, and made substitutions. We can talk about that. There are a small number of instances like this that scholars are very well aware of. And, we get material like Dead Sea Scroll stuff that tell us, okay, here's the oldest text we have. This is what it said. It makes more sense. But what you have going on in Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, the biblical story is that here we are after the flood. God repeats the Adamic, mandate to Noah and his sons, be fruitful, multiply, spread over the earth, make it like Eden. We're going to try this over again. And they don't do it. They congregate at Babel. They build a tower to make a name for themselves. Well, if you know what a ziggurat is part of a temple complex in Mesopotamia, and that's where we're in Babel here. This is the context for it. And you built one of those to localize the deity so that the deity would come down and reside with you. So we could look at that and say, oh, isn't that nice? They want God to live with them. Well, that's actually completely contrary to what God told them to do. And so God is offended at that. It's like, look, we just got out on the other side of the flood here, and you're still not wanting me as your God. You're still not listening. I created you. I want a relationship, yes, but here's what I'm asking you to do. You don't want it, fine. I'm going to allot you now. I'm going to put you under the authority of some of the members of my heavenly host, some of my entourage, some of the sons of God. And you can have them as your gods, or they're going to rule you, and I'm done with you. I'm disinheriting you. I'm divorcing you. And now I'm going to go pick one guy out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and I'm going to raise up a new people to myself. And that people is my inheritance. That people is going to be Israel. Again, that's the biblical story. But, God, even when God does that, when he makes a covenant with Abraham, he says that it's through you that all of those other nations will be blessed. So God doesn't completely disinherit them. He still wants them to come back. There's still this, again, he loves the nations too, but he's punishing them. And that's the part of the story that you never hear when it comes to Babel, this whole idea. But it frames the entirety of the rest of the Old Testament and even on into the New Testament, because the rest of the story is Yahweh against these other gods, because these other gods, the sons of God, become corrupt. Psalm 82, we're told that point blank. They become corrupt in the way they relate to people. They seduce the Israelites into worshiping them instead of directing them to Yahweh. So we have this tension, this conflict between God and the other gods, and we have conflict between Israel and all the other nations. And that's the whole Old Testament. It's the whole story, and it bleeds into the New in various ways that we can talk about or not. But it's an important story. But it tends to, again, here we are back to this focused literalism. Like we have to account for the Cherokee language in Babel as a linguist. No, we don't. Okay, it's not even in view. It's a very regionally isolated group of civilizations, group of cultures. You can try to derive back to one proto language from that. If you exclude the other ones, you can make a case for that. But that isn't the point. It's just not the point. We're so fixated on we've got to take this question that a modern linguist has and find it somewhere in the Bible and read it literalistically, and we miss the bigger story. But this is constantly what happens with people who even have a high view of the Bible. They are trained to read it simplistically and to make it some sort of vanguard or buffer between them and the world of science, or them and the world of linguistics, or something like that. It's just a shame. Just be honest with you, it's just a shame, because you miss the bigger picture constantly when you're doing stuff like this.
So from what I understand, you're saying that the Tower of Babel incident may be more of a localized regional event. And would you have said that about the flood of Noah as well?
Yeah, I think, you get the same thing when you do get to the flood, because if you asked, if you walked up to Noah and said, hey, Noah, can you give me a list of all the nations in the world? What's the world composed of? What is all the earth to you? He'd give you the list in Genesis 10 and say, didn't you memorize this in school? This is their world. So yeah, if the flood is a regional event that affects, all of these nations that are listed in this, well, to them, it's a worldwide event. But again, God knows better. We know better, because the world is bigger than that. So again, we tend to take the story and we take the language of the story and we overclaim from it. In fact, if you go to the flood account and you pick out all the phrases that are used for a global event, phrases like all the earth, was covered with water, or all flesh died, all plus whatever noun in it, you can actually find the exact same phrase elsewhere in the Old Testament, where the context tells you very clearly that the term does not refer to totality or to an exhaustive, it doesn't have an exhaustive sense. For instance, there are passages where something happens and all the people of the earth fled into the forest. Really? Really? Like, how long did it take the guy in Australia? Did he rent a canoe or something? And, it's absurd. It's just an over literalizing of the language. What matters in biblical interpretation is context. Context is king. And the context of all these things, it's given to us. Right there in Genesis 10, that's the world they know. It's the world of the Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean and what we call the Middle East. That's the world to them. So that needs to impact how we view the flood event. That needs to impact how we view the Babel event. Otherwise we're taking a text produced by a writer, again, providentially put in that situation and influenced and prepared by God, again, inspiration. We're taking all of that and saying, well, none of that matters. I'm going to take this passage and I'm going to make it address this modern thing that I'm wondering about. That's called interpreting out of context, not in it. And so context is king, but we usually don't do that. And people who don't do it, I'm not saying they're sinister. I mean, they might be motivated in a very good way. I need to refute or think about evolution or Darwinism or whatever it is, and I need to find this in the Bible somewhere. I need to make the Bible speak to it. Well, they don't realize that they're making the Bible, they're turning the Bible into something it was never intended to be. I mean, I get into conversations like with atheists or whatever, and this, they always criticize the Bible for like science stuff in it that's not modern science. Well, like, no kidding. Why are you mad at a book for not being what it was never intended to be? Are you mad at your daughter for not being your son? Are you mad at your dog for not being your cat? Why would you take a thing and express vitriol toward it for not being what it was never intended to be? And so what I usually ask them is, look, if you can explain how your approach is at all coherent and rational, then we can have a discussion. But until you do, it sounds kind of dumb. Okay, it sounds self-serving at best, and at worst, it sounds kind of dumb. Because you don't really do this with other things, but so why are you committing this act of irrationality here? And of course, the reason is because, I hate to say it, but lots of Christians and people who love the Bible, that's where they put the debate, because of their over-literalizing of the text in many cases. And it's just, again, I think you can tell it. It's a frustration point with me that even operating out of good motives, we make the Bible into something it was never intended to be, and then we expect it to dance to our tune. And it just doesn't produce good results. Just across the board, it doesn't produce good results.
Yeah, I sort of understand that. So if the flood was localized, what about the animals then? I've got a particular interest in Noah's Ark, because when I was younger, I climbed Ararat looking for it, but I didn't find it. But it's completely covered in ice at the top of it, and some people believe that there is still something underneath the ice there. But
yeah, there may be. I don't think a local event rules out an ark or saving the animals. I don't think it rules out any of that. Look, if you have a flood that covers hundreds of thousands of square miles, that's big. Okay, I mean that is no trivial event. It would be shocking. It would be, again, shocking to the point of being etched in the memory of every person who heard about it or witnessed it, or the tradition of it was passed down. I mean, it's not something that you can turn into something that we experience today. We don't experience anything like that today, anything of that kind of scale. So I don't know why. Well, I guess I do know why. A lot of people are offended by the idea of a regional or local flood, again, because that's not how they're taught to think about it. But again, I would challenge people, and I know if you don't have Bible software, it's probably like an insurmountable task, or it's going to be far too much work. But look up all the instances of kol basar, all flesh, whether it's human or animal. Kol haaretz, all the earth. I mean, just look them up. You will find instances where the identical phrases occur, where the context tells us it can't mean totality. And so the interpretive question, the hermeneutical question becomes, well, if the phrase itself doesn't have to speak of totality, could we possibly read non-totality back into the flood account? Well, we have to if we're taking Genesis 10 as being our definition of all the world. But let's say that, to them it was all the world, it can still, be read back into and produce a regional event. What I'm saying is that the local regional reading can be quite biblical, can be quite textually defensible. It just depends again on how you approach the question and what you do with the textual data at your disposal.
So would you be saying also that it doesn't necessarily mean all the species of the world? It just means when it comes to animals, but it means all the animals in that particular region?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you're reading a local regional event, the quote all language would be localized to that region, and within that region, it would be exhaustive. That's why you would need an ark. You want animal life, human life to survive, but it would nevertheless again be read through that filter. And again, all I'm saying, I'm not telling people they have to, take this or that view. All I'm saying is that you have to realize that people who can defend a local regional flood event with the biblical text, they don't have to appeal to geology to do this. And this is not a new thing. I mean, people have been aware of the text for millennia. I mean, it just is what it is, and it can be read that way, even though your tradition probably never introduced you, to such a reading. But the text can be read that way fairly easily.
And when it comes to the origin of Christianity itself, I know that many people say that, especially in the last sort of decade or two, people have been saying that Christianity is just the same stories borrowed from earlier religions, including the flood account, Gilgamesh. What would you say to that?
I would say they need to read the New Testament. I mean that claims like that are offered by people who have refused to invest the time into reading the material. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. What possible relationship would the story of Jesus have to Gilgamesh? I mean, it's just absurd. Now, if you want to talk about the Old Testament, the problem, the key word there is borrowing. All right. When a scholar uses the word borrowing, like this let's just take the flood story. Okay, the flood story here in the Bible, or the creation story, or XYZ, story. When a scholar says borrowed from like Mesopotamian material, what they typically mean is that they can trace a word or a phrase or the structure of a passage to another text, to a text that's external to the Bible. For instance, this is probably a better example, even though it's a little more esoteric. The way Genesis 1 begins, it begins with Bereshit, which is a preposition plus, noun, and then you have a clause and so on and so forth. And you keep going, through the clause types and the clause structures of the first three verses. Well, those mimic the first few lines of Enuma Elish, syntactically, grammatically. The content is different, but the structure is the same. And so scholars have looked at that and thought, okay, this is a good clue that Genesis is going to be written as some sort of response, some sort of polemic, some sort of poke in the eye, theologically, religiously, to this text, because it's mimicking part of it. Now that kind of thing, there's a close interaction between two texts, Bible and non-Bible, that kind of thing. But a lot of the stuff conceptually, okay, beliefs about the afterlife, or beliefs about a local or a flood event just generally. This kind of thing you don't need actual borrowing for. What you have is you have a common culture, because all of these nations, these other texts, Egyptian, Akkadian, Sumerian, they all come from the same general geographic region. And so there's going to be a cross-fertilization of ideas just because of proximity. So you don't actually have literary borrowing, but you do have a common experience, you have a common culture, you have a common set of ideas. Now, that's why there's a lot of sameness between the Bible and some of these other texts. But the problem is that people stop there. They'll mislabel something as borrowing, but then they stop there and they don't ask, well, what's different? What are the differences between the two? And theologically, there are significant differences between the Old or New Testament especially, and something in the ancient Near East. Yeah, there's a lot of sameness, even religiously, culturally, in terms of worldview. There's a lot of that. Again, it doesn't have to be direct borrowing. There's a lot of that, but there are also really, really crucial differences. Well, I'll give you one today. Okay, Islam is monotheistic, and so is Judaism, and so is Christianity. If you think they're teaching the same things, you're just terribly mistaken. And I'm talking theology here. I'm not talking politically. Christianity has a Trinity. Okay, the Old Testament has God, plural Elohim, and also God in human form. The Quran explicitly, militantly denies both of those things, but yet they're both monotheistic. They both have the same cultural, regional context. Well, yeah, they do. But you'd have to be an idiot to say that, oh, they basically teach the same things. That tells me you haven't read any of it. Okay, there are clear, fundamental, crucial differences between what the texts are saying, what they're asking, their followers to adhere to in terms of belief systems.
And are there any other religious texts that mention virgin births and 12 disciples or 12 followers of any kind and resurrections?
Well, let's take resurrect. The answer would be it depends how you. This is going to sound crazy. It depends how you define virgin. I'll give you an example, because like at Ugarit, you have the goddess. You have Anat, and you have other goddesses, but we'll just pick Anat. Anat is called a virgin, okay, but she's also a whore. She's the mistress of other gods. Well, she's not a sexual virgin, so what do we mean by this virgin type? And again, they have their own definition for that. It's typically it's a term you would use sort of in a cultic sense, where it has to do with the concepts of sacred marriage and whatnot. So yeah, it depends, because you have sacred marriage ideas across the board in ancient Near Eastern texts, and they mostly don't involve true sexual virginity of a human woman. Typically this language is used of some sort of goddess figure. But in the Gospels, it's very clearly a human woman. It's very clearly literal virginity, because we get added details. Joseph did not know, his wife Mary until after she had given birth to Jesus. You have these lines in there to distinguish the way we're talking about this as opposed to the way somebody else would talk about it. So, the writers are, use care in that sense, because they know they have to tell you what's going on here, as opposed to what you might think when you read the passage. Resurrection, again, it depends how you define resurrection. Does resurrection mean that when a god or let's just take Baal, because Baal at Ugarit is typically viewed as a resurrection figure? Well, first of all, Baal was never born incarnate of a human woman and didn't physically die and then rose in the same body. But Baal does have, he does go to war with death and defeats death, the god Mot, in his effort for co-rulership of the gods in the pantheon at Canaan. The two ideas are not the same. Even Egypt, the whole Isis Osiris cycle. Yeah, Osiris is dead, and well, he's raised from the dead. He becomes animated back to life. Yeah, he does, but guess what? He's Lord of the Dead, and he's always depicted as green, which means he's cadaverous. This is not the resurrection idea that you get in the Gospels. So it just depends how things are talked about, and really, I'll say this: how much respect people have for each text that they're talking about. The Zeitgeist people, will look at Osiris and they'll try to make it sound like the New Testament, and in doing so, they deliberately misread and I would say dishonor the Egyptian material, because they are bending it to their agenda. Okay, Osiris does not have the kind of physical resurrection. In other words, back to the land of the living that you see in the New Testament. Osiris becomes animate again, but he is in the realm of the dead. That's where he is. He doesn't go back to earth. It is a deliberate misreading of Egyptian material. And if I were an Egyptian, I'd be offended. Okay. But again, the Zeitgeist crowd won't tell you stuff like this. They will draw superficial analogies to, one text to the other, again, to drive a particular agenda they have. And that is, I can't think of a better word for it. That's just dishonest. I mean, you can reject the claims of the New Testament, but at least be honest when you're doing it. That's just dishonest. And if it's not dishonesty, it's incompetence. So take your pick. You're either not real smart, or you're just deceptive. Just be honest. I don't believe X, Y, or Z. Fine. It's a free world. Believe whatever you want or not believe whatever you want, but just don't be deceptive or dishonest about it.
On the same sort of lines, when I was younger, I read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and I think they made movies based on that, didn't they? With Tom Hanks. Can't remember what it's called now. Da Vinci Code.
Yeah. What's his Dan Brown sort of?
Yeah.
I don't know if he credits Michael Bagent or not. Maybe he does. I don't want to say Brown stole some of the ideas, but I think he credits him.
Yeah, and so some of the premise is that Jesus might have been married. Is there any evidence in the Bible of that?
No, there's also no evidence for it in the Gnostic texts. And again, this is a case of deliberate deception. You know, Dan Brown and others before him refer to a Nag Hammadi gospel text where it says that Jesus kissed Mary on the mouth. Well, guess what? If you actually go to the Nag Hammadi texts, and they're all printed in facsimile, they've all been transcribed and, of course, translated, where it says on the mouth, there's actually no text. It's a hole in the text. It literally doesn't exist. So Michael Bagent and Dan Brown and many others just decide to say he kissed her on the mouth, and then they extrapolated that from that they must have been married. It's entirely fabricated, entirely. But again, it's you can't make movies out of examining ancient texts and saying, look, there's a hole there. That just doesn't sell tickets or books. Okay, what sells those things is to fill in the gaps and make a sensational story out of it and never tell people that, oh yeah, we made that up. But that is exactly what happened in this case. And again, I didn't publish the Nag Hammadi text. Okay, it's Brill. It's a respected academic publisher. James Robinson's the editor. He's a well-known scholar in the Gnostic world. He's favorably disposed to Gnosticism. Great. His edition of the stuff shows you, and you again go look at pictures of the text, the manuscripts themselves. There's a hole there. So again, this is what sort of yanks my chain. People can believe whatever they want, and if you're honest, then you can have a discussion about, okay, what's more coherent, what you assign validity to or what I assign validity to. Then you can have an intelligent discussion. But what you can't have an intelligent discussion about is when someone either doesn't know they're being lied to, there's a hole here, or they don't care. Because the first person has been deceived and maybe doesn't want to look at the data. The second person has just jumped the shark. That's an American expression. I don't know if your listeners will be familiar with that, but they've just detached themselves from reality.
We have a lot of American listeners, by the way, as well. So,
okay. Yeah, I mean, you've just willingly detached yourself from rationality, from reality. And the reality is there's a hole there. So if you just want to deny that, well, then, nothing I say is going to help. You're like a Christian flat earther, and there are some of those out there that just make me want to cry, to be honest. That's where you're at. Nothing. I can't appeal to your rationality because it's gone at that point. So this is the kind of thing I object to.
In Holy Blood, Holy Grail, it is full of quite a lot of speculative language that's kind of similar to Ancient Aliens, really. Saying phrases like "could it be" or "what if."
Yeah, that's there so nobody can successfully sue the guy. It's a cottage industry of sensationalistic stuff, and I'm not on the other side of this that says, and anybody who knows me knows I'm not on this side of it either, that, oh, if the church told you that must be the way to look at it. Okay, I'm not there either by any stretch. Okay, what I care about are the texts. What can the text sustain? Don't lie about the text. Analyze the text for what it said. A writer actually meant to communicate something here. Let's do our best to try to figure that out. Context is king, all this stuff. What I'm opposed to is fabrication. I'm opposed to the sort of tunnel vision that you get within organized religion, where this text must mean this because our forefather, some guy living in the 2nd or 3rd century, said it does. That's just as illegitimate to me. Okay, that guy that early church father may have been a wonderful guy and was probably smarter than I am. Okay, I'll own both of those things. But guess what? He's over a millennia removed from the text he's talking about. He couldn't read Hebrew, and he didn't have any of these other primary texts from the ancient Near Eastern world even translated in his own language so that he could recapture the context. Fortunately, I do. That puts me in an advantage. I don't have to be as smart as Augustine or some other guy. I don't have to be, in their shoes, because I just have more material that they didn't have. And so it behooves me to get off my butt and do some work here to understand these texts. I'm not just going to take what this guy who couldn't read Hebrew said about it. I'm sorry, but that just doesn't make much sense. So I'm not on the other side either. It's just I care about the text and what they can sustain, and let's try to be honest with data. It's not that much more complicated, at least with what I try to do.
And regarding the text, there's a lot of people, again, probably non-Christians, who would say that you can't really believe this as a holy book. The original text has changed over the centuries, and also that the the books that were chosen to put in the Bible were chosen by, religious leaders, and there were actually other books as well that were discarded. Is there any truth to the fact that the original text has changed over the centuries, and why were the choices made for the particular books?
Well, there's no way to argue coherently that let's just say the book of Isaiah is in every letter exactly the same today as it was when Isaiah or whoever penned it. Okay. But that, again, that takes something that's obvious, and then people extrapolate to the absurd with it, or to the incoherent. It's not that, every other word in Isaiah is now a different word, or every 10th word, excuse me, in Isaiah is a different word. That is just not true. Does it make any difference if Isaiah said to or unto? Ooh, what big truth hangs on those two prepositions? Which one was who cares? Okay, ultimately, who cares? It doesn't change meaning. There are lots of changes in spellings. There are lots of changes at a minute level by copyists. It's really unusual if you have a textual difference between manuscripts where interpretation really is affected. And I can say that with confidence. You know why? Because people have devoted their lives to collecting these things, and they've been published. They're in apparatuses you can buy either in digital or print form to study the Hebrew Bible. We know what this stuff is. Okay, so it's a misunderstanding of the process of textual transmission to say that, oh, the text has just changed everywhere. We can't know what the guy was talking about. Well, actually, with 99% of the time, yeah, we can know quite well what he was talking about. Again, if we disregard, is it Stephen with a V or with a PH? Oh, that's a change in the text. Oh, what are we going to do? Well, let's just abandon all hope, all you who enter here to read this text. It's just absurd. But that's the way people want to characterize this. Isaiah didn't write his book, and now we have the phone book. Again, it's just an absurdity. It's equally absurd to think, again, that we have every letter in exact sequence and nothing ever. I mean, that's an absurdity on the other side. Lots of people devoted their lives to collecting and collating manuscript data and analyzing it, producing the data so that others can analyze it so that you don't have to take their word for it. It's painstaking, I would say, mind-numbing work. I'm glad I'm not a textual critic, but I'm glad textual critics are out there. That I can use the things they produce to look at text. It's wonderful. But let's not take, again, something that's real and extrapolate to the absurd or the incorrect. Now, when it comes to the books, this is actually a less mysterious process, again, than people want to portray. I think the New Testament is more poorly understood, or maybe I should say deliberately sort of tarnished than the Old Testament. I mean, there's within their respective communities, okay, within the Jewish community, all the way back, to biblical times, there were people recognized as prophets, spokespeople for God. What they wrote, what their disciples wrote as they recorded their sayings, those were collected, and they were assigned, a particular status. It's a very neat line of tradition on the Old Testament side. There were only 2 or 3 books that people argued about. Song of Solomon. Oh, there's a lot of sexual content in there. Should we really give this the same status? Okay. Ecclesiastes. Oh, the guy sounds like such a pessimist, even though you could disagree with that. Should we put it in or not? Is this sacred or not? Again, there's 2 or 3 of those. But the Jewish community, again, reached consensus, and it was an overwhelming consensus. And so we have this thing we call the Old Testament. New Testament side, there's this myth about, that all of these gospels, they have the 4 that are in the New Testament and these other ones that, are from Nag Hammadi, Gnostic, gospels. All of these were at one time considered equal in status, but then the organized church came about and just, weeded out the ones they didn't like. Again, that is not the case, because we have lists of which books the worldwide, again, speaking of the Mediterranean here at that time in history, the Roman Empire, we have lists of gospels and, wider than that, the whole New Testament, books that were assigned sacred status by the believing community all over the known world. No Gnostic gospel is ever in any list. Okay, that tells you right away that they weren't even debated. In particular, the Gospel of Thomas, which is the one that sort of gets the most news, that was of Eastern origin, in the Eastern wing of the church, the eastern part of the empire. Where that was circulated the most, we have a book called Tatian's Diatessaron now, and what it was a harmony of the Gospels. Even Tatian didn't include Thomas in his harmony. He assigned it lesser status. Okay, so even though the Gnostics may have liked a book or whatever, there were other Christians living in the same geographical regions that when you polled them, okay, when you asked them which ones should be assigned, this particular status to, they're never included. Now that doesn't mean they're not valuable. I mean, I take a book like First Enoch, and lots of Christians, like the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch was really important, and we ought to read it. But a book doesn't have to be canonical. It doesn't have to be viewed as inspired for it to be important. Enoch was very important, at least to Peter and Jude, because they draw ideas from it in the books that they wrote that wind up in the New Testament. All of this stuff is important. We ought to read all of it because the New Testament writers were familiar with a lot of it. Now, the Gnostic Gospels post-date. They're later by a century or more than the canonical Gospels. That's really the reason they weren't included in the list, because they were Johnny-come-latelys. They were things written well after the apostolic period. So that's why they don't show up in any of these early lists, because they weren't around. It's not that they were weeded out. And there's this myth about, Constantine determined what New Testament at the Council of Nicaea. Well, guess what? We actually have notes from the Council of Nicaea, and Constantine didn't do that. What Constantine did, and for your listeners, if they want to read a really good book on this, it's an academic book, but it's readable. Constantine's Bible is a really good book on this. What Constantine did was he said, look, fellows, I call this conference, the big questions are, the deity of Jesus and the whole Aryan matter and all that kind of stuff. But they made a list of decisions, and one of the things that Constantine wanted, he said, look, I'm essentially tired of this bickering or this indecision about, sacred status of books. I want you guys to produce X number of copies. It was either 50 or 100. The number escapes me, but I want copies produced of the New Testament, and I want them distributed. And he gave them a time frame. Okay, I want this done. And he's like, so long. So he puts the church in a pickle. He puts them in a difficult position. So now the church has to decide, okay, how are we going to do this? And the church comes up with a simple method. Give us the list of books that everyone accepts and that there's no bickering about. And that's going to become our New Testament. We are going to assume that the Spirit of God will move in the masses, the mass of the believing community, that if there's an overwhelming consensus of these are the ones that we can trace to apostolic authority, and that's our minimalist list, then that should be good enough. And we will put those, we will bind them in one volume, and we'll copy them. We'll make the emperor happy, so he's not mad at us and that kind of thing. Constantine didn't pick the books. He just said, get it done. And they did. And the New Testament we have today is this minimalist list. It's the ones that everybody agreed on. So if it's not in the New Testament, it's because there was significant disagreement among the whole, the church, worldwide church at the time. There was disagreement about it, or it didn't win any favor. And the canonical Gospels, again, were part of that. Again, and the reason is because they were late. They couldn't be traced to apostolic authority or from the hand of an apostle. If it was a couple centuries beyond the apostolic period, well, of course they couldn't have written it. Of course, one of their companions that they traveled with, like Luke, of course he couldn't have written it. It's not from the apostolic age, so by definition, it doesn't have the same status. Again, it's not rocket science, but we've turned this into some conspiratorial, one-person cabal named Constantine that picked the books of the New Testament. It's just not true from the primary documentation of the period.
Yeah, thanks for going into that. That clears up a few things for me. Anyway, I wanted to sort of compare the Old and New Testament a little bit. They're quite different in some ways. In the Old Testament, it seems like there's a God who can be quite violent in some ways. Condoning the cutting off of limbs and things like that, which is still practiced today in places like Saudi Arabia. And then you've got the New Testament with Jesus, and seems to be a very peaceful kind of guy. How do we kind of explain the big differences between the Old and the New Testament, and the kind of feeling you get from both of those books?
Yeah, I think it's legitimate to say if you read through the Testaments, Old and New Testament, if you just read through it, quickly, you're going to get this impression. But if you drill down a little bit, it's less of a distinction than you would think. And what I mean by that is the covenant that God establishes in the Old Testament with his people, in Deuteronomy 7 and 8, very bluntly, he says, the Lord chose you because he loved you. He also, cares for the Gentiles, the Abrahamic covenant. Through you, through the descendants of Abraham, all the other nations will be blessed. And this is God's idea, to bless the nations. Okay, there are lots of acts of mercy to both Israelite and non-Israelite in the Old Testament. There are calls to repentance all over the Old Testament so that mercy can be extended. The God of the Old Testament gets portrayed as though he's a merciless killing machine or something like that. And you can only say that if you weed out all of the passages to the contrary. And there are a lot of them. Now, in the New Testament, you get more of an emphasis on love, through Jesus. But guess what? It's the God of the Old Testament in biblical theology who sent Jesus. It's the God of the Old Testament who was planning to do this during the Old Testament days. This whole messianic idea. And the Messiah is never focused only on his own portion, drawing from Deuteronomy 32:9. It's never focused only on Israel or only on the Israelite or the Jew. It's always focused on the entirety of all peoples. And that comes to fruition in the New Testament. And because the New Testament takes the story from the point of the incarnation, the story of the Messiah, and so on and so forth, then it naturally gets emphasis because this is the point that we are at now. But all of these good things that you see in the New Testament have their antecedents in the Old, including the whole John 3:16 thing. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Okay, that isn't a New Testament idea invented in the New Testament period. That is an Old Testament idea whose culmination is reached in the New Testament. So there's a bit of a disconnect. Even I would say it's legitimate to see one thing more prominent than the other, but it's a misunderstanding and a misreading to say one testament has only this idea and the other testament has only that idea. That isn't, something that you can say and be correct. But prominence, you can make a case for that because of the history of Israel. There's a lot of warfare going on. Incidentally, the violence of the Old Testament, it's predicated on certain metaphors about God. God is a father. God has children. People who want to kill God's children, God retaliates against and kills. Okay, I would do the same for my children. I don't have any problem, I didn't. My kids are older now, but I had no problem. I can't remember a specific instance of ever doing it. There might have been one. I don't know, but I could look my kids in the eye, my little kids in the eye, and say, look, if somebody breaks into the house, and if Daddy has to kill that person to save you and Mommy, Daddy will do that. I hope that never happens, but Daddy will do that. In other words, I'm telling you, I value your life so much that I will take another life to preserve yours. Okay, there's a reason why there are father and son, father and children, family metaphors in the Old Testament used constantly about God. The whole bride, Israel is the bride of God. It's the same thing. This is why God is portrayed as jealous, because he's made a commitment to Israel, and the metaphor to express that commitment is marriage. Well, if I love you and I've committed myself to you against all others, that I'm not going to pick any others, I'm not going to violate, our marriage. And if you violate it, I'm going to be mad. My jealousy is going to derive from the fact that I loved you and committed myself to you, and you've lied to me. Again, family metaphors are ubiquitous in the Old Testament, and this is the framework for some of this other language, and we kind of lose that. But when we examine ourselves, our own hearts, I think you'd be a poor husband if you weren't angry and jealous if your wife violated your marriage. I think you'd be a poor father if you didn't defend your children to the ultimate extent. I think you'd be a lousy dad if you didn't do that. And again, this is the way it's cast in the Old Testament, but we kind of miss that because we get focused on the particular description of a battle or this particular command where God, tells Joshua, go and, wipe out this town. And we don't ask questions like, well, who's in the town? What are they thinking? Why are they doing this? Is there a rationale to this that might be a decade old or centuries old or whatever? What's going on here? What's the bigger picture? We tend to not ask questions like that. Again, because we're not thinking on the same terms as the writers, the original writers and the original readers, how they would have how they would have read these things.
Yeah, and the New Testament definitely does seem to be more peaceful, but
Oh, it is.
people sometimes point to one phrase that Jesus said, I came not to send peace, but a sword.
Mhm.
Is there any linguistic analysis that can cast more light onto what was meant by that?
Yeah, that statement actually appears in both Matthew and Luke. And interestingly enough, there's a very similar statement in the Gospel of Thomas about this. But what's usually quoted is Matthew's version, and that's a little shorter. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, Matthew 10:34. Over in Luke, we have, do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. And then he says, father against mother, and so on and so forth. It's a longer passage. Well, that's important because the phrase about division within the household not only gives it context, but also links it back into the Old Testament. Jesus is actually drawing on something in the Old Testament, and that is the notion of tribulation. So this statement by Jesus is not some statement that, hey, I want everybody to start gathering swords so that we can go attack our enemies. It's not an offensive weapon kind of thing. If you link it back to the Old Testament, specifically in Micah 7, verses 5 and 6 thereabout, which Matthew 10 actually quotes, part of it, the idea is that when the Messiah comes, before Israel is restored from exile completely, before that happens, there's going to be a lot of strife. Specifically in Matthew 10 and in Luke, it's set in the context, the wider context, of the persecution of believers. That's what the concept of tribulation is in both testaments. The Old Testament refers to it, for instance, as the time of Jacob's trouble. So it's the followers of the Messiah that right before, again, the ultimate restoration of Israel, associated with the messianic presence, they're going to be in severe trouble. People are going to be after them to kill them. They're going to be under persecution. It's going to be bad, and it's going to be violent. So Jesus says, look, in one passage, it's not just a sword. Take up a sword, but take a cloak with you. Be ready to flee. Again, this is an endorsement of self-defense, self-protection. It's not let's arm ourselves and create an army here. And it's easy to see the rest of the story of the Gospels and on into the book of Acts and of course the epistles. This is the way it's always cast, that we are allowed to protect ourselves. We are under persecution. We should be willing to suffer, again, as Jesus suffered. And again, look at what Jesus says, again, right before one of these statements in Luke. He says, I came to cast fire on the earth, and would it that we're already kindled again, because then, the kingdom of God's going to be restored. And he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress. In other words, Jesus says, look, they're going to come and get me. And as the things that you see me suffer, you are going to suffer too. And this is the way it was foretold. This is what's going to happen. So yeah, get ready to take up your cloak so that you can flee in the night. Take up a sword. Luke chapter 22. You're going to need them. You're going to have to defend yourselves because you're going to become public enemy number one as I am public enemy number one. So be ready for it. This is part of my coming. This is just what's going to happen. So again, we tend to in our day again read that as, oh well, Jesus sounds just like this other group over here. Go out and kill people. Again, you have to tear it out of not only its own context in the Gospels, other things Jesus says near to it, in near proximity to it, but you also have to tear it out of its Old Testament context to read it that way. But people do that. It's just what they do.
We started at the beginning, and we're moving closer to the end now, and so probably appropriate to talk about the end and the second coming of Christ and Revelations. Do you think there's any clues in the Bible that can give us a more understanding of when Jesus might be coming back, and as to who people like the Antichrist might be?
Yeah, I don't think we're given any sort of specificity on that. So I guess I get to play the stick in the mud there. Lots of people want to come up with these intricate chronological schemes or blood moon astronomy stuff, and again, we are not told any of that in the New Testament. My view of end times is we're not supposed to know. And I base that on what happened the first time around. I'll go into churches sometimes, and again, just to wake people up, I'll say things like, do you realize there's no verse in the Old Testament that describes a dying and rising Messiah who would atone for the sins of mankind. And people look at you like you got two heads. Hey, you're in church. How can you say that? But it's true. There is no one verse that says that. The messianic profile is not given in a verse or two or three or four. It is scattered in 100 places. It is fragmented. You could only discern it after the fact. And this is what the Gospels actually tell us. I mean, there's a scene where you have the resurrected Christ in the upper room with the disciples. He's standing in front of them, and the text says he had to open their minds to understand. They still don't get it, even at that point. And the reason they don't get it is because it's not spelled out. It's not clear. And Paul has a really interesting phrase as to why this is. In 1 Corinthians 2, he says, had the rulers of this world known, again, rulers of this world is a Pauline phrase for the spiritual powers of darkness. He said, had the rulers of this world known what was going to happen, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. Because this is the thing that had to happen for death to be overcome, for spiritual victory, for the powers of darkness to be defeated ultimately. This is the thing that had to happen, the event of the cross. And Paul's saying, look, if they could have figured this out, they would have never done it, because they're not morons. And that's the way prophecy really works. It's cryptic. It's scattered in 100 places. You're not supposed to just be able to read it and know. And my view is, look, if this is the way it worked the first time around, this is why the second time around, all this second coming stuff, this is why there are so many ambiguities. This is why no one can figure out a system. This is why even Jesus himself, when he came as a man, again, you have the limitations of incarnation. He says, look, even I don't know the exact time, the day or the hour. There are some generalities we can talk about, but even he, had to say that. And it's because this is by design. The ambiguity is by design. So my view of prophecy is just that. But again, that doesn't sell books. It doesn't, get you likes on Facebook, or things like that. It just, I get to be the stick in the mud. So go ahead and try out your new system. Again, I can understand it, and I will know, again, because of my training, I will know all of its weaknesses that you will not tell your readers about. And that's just unfortunate, because you're leading them to believe a certain thing that, when it turns out to not be true, is going to damage them.
But it doesn't, when it talks about the mark of the beast, doesn't it sort of almost seem to encourage people to calculate it? It says something like, "Let him who understands calculate."
Yeah, let him who understands. I mean, it's interesting that John there in Revelation, he he gives you the number. So it's not that you have to figure out the number because he gives it to you, but you have to figure out the meaning of the number. And the text, you can translate it one of two ways. This is the number of a man, or you can also translate it, this is a human number. And if you take the second option, then that takes you into the whole area of gematria. Now, gematria does show up in the Bible in a few legitimate places. I don't believe in Bible codes. I think the premise of Bible codes, specifically the equidistant letter sequencing codes, is just doomed from the outset. It's dead on arrival because of how manuscripts work. But something like gematria, where you have numbers that correspond to letters, again, this is very old. It's not just in the Bible; it's in other texts that people use this technique because they use letters of the alphabet to represent numbers as well. It's nothing mystical. But if you take that approach, then 666 can point to certain individuals. Again, depending on how you understand it, or it can point to something called magic squares, which were a big part of the New Testament world. And 666, let's just take the latter. 666 is the magic square of the sun. And the representation of the sun was Zeus. Zeus's Old Testament counterpart was Baal. And so you have, again, not a terribly cryptic, but you have an encrypted reference to this person will be identified with the Satan figure. Okay, he'll be the personification of evil. And that's about all you can conclude from it. Well, you can sort of get that from the rest of the story in Revelation too. But if you take it as spelling, mathematical spelling, well, then you get somebody like Nero Caesar, whose name can be 666, depending on how you spell his title and his name. It can also be 616, which is a number that shows up in other manuscripts of Revelation instead of 666. So Nero has the advantage or the disadvantage of actually matching both, depending, again, how you spell his name in either Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Again, we're just not told more than that. If it points to Nero, okay, well, has the Antichrist already come and gone? Again, that's a logical question. Or is this the type of person we can expect? Again, that's an interpretive issue. who knows?
So you
So even that has a certain elasticity that you won't know until after the fact, until you see all the rest of these things that are in Revelation, some of the other epistles, until after you see them play out in real time. Then you'll be able to look back and go, okay, now I know which path I should have taken interpretively, but I couldn't figure that out ahead of time.
So you haven't stayed up late at night trying to
I
calculate
haven't.
if Obama's the Antichrist or anything?
No, I don't like Obama's politics, but I think I can say with a fair amount of certitude that he is not the Antichrist.
And just a couple of more things actually. Wormwood. I was always interested in what that refers to, and I know you're not a big believer in Planet X, but do you have any theories as to what this Wormwood star might be?
Well, I think it is an astronomical or a celestial referent. I mean, we get we get these things in the Gospels. The sign of the Son of Man. Okay, the stars in heavens will be shaken. You get wormwood. You get this again astronomical symbology, the celestial stuff, and it could be a reference to astronomical portents. In other words, what scholars would refer to as astrotheology, the idea that the heavens could communicate in broad terms when certain things were happening. When epochs were beginning and ending, when the divine king was being born, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, and that's legit. And on the broader terms, I mean, Paul actually discusses things like that in Romans 10. And he quotes Psalm 19, the heavens declaring the glory of God, the signs in the heavens have a voice, all this kind of thing. So, in broad terms, there is this notion again that acts in the heavens can be portents of what God is up to, just in broad strokes. But beyond that, I don't think you can really, align it successfully in an interpretive sort of way with anything terribly specific, because we just aren't told this sort of thing. Now, the Planet X thing, my criticism of that really goes back to what Zecharia Sitchin and his followers did or still do with his ideas, based on, I can't even say his reading of cuneiform text, because he literally just makes stuff up too that don't exist in the text. But essentially what he does here, that there's this planet Nibiru that the Anunnaki come from. It cycles through our solar system every 3,600 years and blah, 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 blah. Well, again, the cuneiform texts don't say any of that. They don't say any of that about Nibiru. It never connects Nibiru with the Anunnaki. He literally just made it up. I mean, I have a video, a very boring video, on one of my websites, sitchiniswrong.com, where I take people to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. Here we are. It's a screen capture video of Mike at the website. Type in the term for Anunnaki, hit the button. There you get all the references in Sumerian literature to the Anunnaki. Go look them up. Hit the little TR so you get an English translation, and look them up. There's a little over 100 of them. When I tell you that this idea does not exist, that the Anunnaki are never connected to Nibiru and all this sort of stuff, when I tell you it's made up, don't take my word for it. Go look. Go run the search yourself. Again, it's boring, but I'm trying to get people to go look at primary texts. And so I don't, when it comes to Planet X, that's the thing I'm sort of shooting at. I'm not shooting at the idea that the ancients would associate cataclysmic religious events or cataclysmic earthly events with portents in the sky. They certainly did some of that, but I don't think we're told, again, really too much in terms of specifics as like what wormwood is. Which object is it? Is it an asteroid? Is it something else? Or is it just symbolic of something more generally chaotic in the heavens? We're just not told.
And do you think that's part of the problem, is that analyzing the facts is a bit boring, and actually believing
Yes, I'm the lord of boredom when it comes to that.
No, but people find escapism and fantasy a bit more alluring sometimes.
No, that's true. And I'll confess, I like things like science fiction that take this material and then reimagine it in a storyline and some epic narrative. That's fun. I enjoy it. But I always caution people, especially Christians, which is saying, look, an obsession with this kind of stuff is really a waste of time. It not only is going to be ultimately fruitless, because you can erect a beautiful system, but I can tell you right now, and if we get into a conversation, I will expose it. I know, because there are weaknesses in all of these erected systems. I know where the weaknesses are because I've taught through this stuff. This is my training. Okay. You can do that. It looks beautiful and wonderful, but only because you've masked or omitted or explained away the outliers. Why spend so much time trying to erect one of these and then defend it? Why aren't you out doing the things that Jesus really wanted you to do? Bearing one another's burdens, taking care of people, giving them the gospel. Why aren't you doing that? Instead, you're sitting there with your calipers and your calculators and your astronomical charts or whatever. It's just not productive. This is not part of the Great Commission. It's also not part of the gospel. And I know people that get so married to their system of end times thinking that if you don't believe it, then they question your commitment to the gospel. They question, are you really a Christian? And that's bad theology right there. I mean, that is so misguided to connect these ideas, but people just get sucked into this because it's fun to think about. There's a wonder, a mystery element to it. But you got to realize, look, if you believe, Mr. Christian, if you believe that this thing that you call the New Testament is inspired, that it really came from God, and if there are ambiguities in it, why don't you believe that that was God's decision, that God wants it that way, and then just leave it there? Why are you trying to improve on this thing God gave you? People don't want to hear that. But again, I'm the guy who gets to play the stick in the mud and gets to tell people that, and winning hearts and minds every day doing it. I just think we should be honest with the material at our disposal.
And how just to finish, last question: how are people taking the information that you're presenting? Do you have? I'm sure you have some support. Is it equal support, and people are against the message?
The only real measure I have of that is, okay, the book, The Unseen Realm, again, and what the book is really about is I'm trying to convince people, look, the right context for interpreting the Bible is not yours. It's not the Reformation. It's not the Catholic Church. It's not the Puritans. It's not American evangelicalism. It's none of these. These are all alien contexts. The right context for interpreting the Bible is the context that produced the thing. So I want the Israelite living in your head. I want the first century Jew living in your head, because these are the people who produced the thing that God chose to produce it. And that's the only way you're really going to understand it. Now that's greeted predominantly. If you go look at Amazon, go look at reviews of the book, overwhelmingly people are appreciative of that. I do get a few people that, there's one review up there that I just love that says, this book just freaked me out and I stopped. Don't read it. Thank you for being honest. I like that one, because that tells you right where that person's at, that I'm not playing in your box and you need the box. Well, again, I understand that's what happens, but overwhelmingly, I think people are appreciative of the fact that, look, let's just sort of try to look at it the way they would have looked at it and see what sort of comes out of that. And that's thrilling to a lot of people because they discover so many new things. They don't have blinders on. They haven't had the content filtered to them through their own traditions. So if that's a measure, then I'm happy. I have plenty of detractors and enemies and haters on the internet. I can read comments on my blog, and I get things by email, that call me this or that name. So you get that, but it's not going to deter me from doing what I do, because ultimately I do think that this is more interesting than having content filtered to you through layers of tradition. If you assign importance to this book, especially if you assign something like sacred status to this book, then you ought to be reading that book on its own terms, not someone else's. And I think that's valuable.
And so the book you've written is the Unseen Realm. And what's the? Can you give us details about your website?
Sure. My homepage is Dr. as in Dr. DRMSH. Those are my initials. drmsh.com. And that's sort of my nerve center. I have a bunch of other websites. I have 3 blogs. I have a podcast of my own, the Naked Bible Podcast. People can go to my homepage, drmsh.com, and find anything else I do, including links to the book. But you can go right up to Amazon, either in the UK or any other Amazon site for that matter, and find the book there. So just put my last name in and Unseen Realm, and you will find it, and other things too. But that's the one that is the most current.
Well, thank you very, very much for coming on Truth Sentinel. It's been been a pleasure talking to you, and in some ways it kind of made me think that this is what sermons at churches should be like, answering really difficult questions, and some of the questions that people have been asking for a long time that rarely get answered in church. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And by the way, I do agree with that.
Thanks, Michael.
Yep. Thank you.